Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming this evening. We're particularly pleased to be able to welcome Caroline Lucas here. This is the first in the series of Charles Clarke in Conversation, first of 4 in the series. And without further ado, I'll allow Charles to introduce our guest.
Lee, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all of you for coming this evening. As Lee said, it's the first in the post-general election series, and to be honest, I was a little bit nervous how many people would come, but I'm delighted so many of you have been ready to give time this evening to listen to what Caroline has to say. Caroline has an extraordinary achievement to her name, which is that she is the first Green Member of Parliament in the UK Parliament, and that is an extraordinary breakthrough that she achieved in 2010. But what I'm hoping that we're going to do this evening is simply to talk about what took Caroline into politics. Why did she get into politics in the first place? Why she thinks politics matters. What she thinks she's achieved in politics. How should politics change? Is it all perfectly okay as it is now, or does it need to change in lots of different ways? The answer is one that many would share, but few can achieve. You had a fairly conventional upbringing, and just looking at your background in Malvern, it seemed, and then you went to university, studied English literature, got a first-class degree. At what point in that period of your life would you say you started thinking politics might be something you might think about doing, rather than being an academic, because you're obviously very successful academically, or another form of life? What made you think politics was something you might do?
I think politics with a capital P was something that I came to relatively late. I think it was much more of an issue-based concern for me. So I got very involved with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, and that was my route into politics in many ways. And so I suppose in the early 80s, for those of you who can still remember the early 80s, it was a time when nuclear war seemed a very real possibility, when the cruise missiles were based at Greenham Common, when there were plenty of demonstrations and protests and concern about the risks associated with nuclear weapons. And in a sense, it's quite hard now to put ourselves back into that mindset, although I think we probably should be rather more concerned about it than most people are today, because the risks haven't gone away. So it was getting involved in CND when I was a student, and then also feeling that I was being pulled in lots of different directions. So I was very active in CND. I was quite active in some of the green groups at university, concerned about women's issues and feminism as well. But I kind of felt that I was being pulled in lots of different directions, and there weren't connections between the different things I was doing. And apart from being very exhausting, because it meant that practically every night you were out doing something, it was also not very satisfying to see the connections. And that's when I read Jonathan Porritt's book, Seeing Green. And it's a book that still merits a reread. And in a sense, it's quite scary to think that so little has changed in the 30 years since he wrote it. But what it did for me, that book, Seeing Green, was to make the connections between the way we treat the planet, the way we treat each other, the way we treat conflict, and how we think we best resolve conflict. And he brought all that together in a single framework, if you like, but also, as well as making the connections between them, put forward a set of fairly rigorous policy solutions. And so essentially, for me, that was the Green Party. That was what he was talking about. And
the policy solutions were, in your view, practical, i.e. it was not just a question of expressing an emotion or a sense of protest. It was a policy approach which you thought you could help put into effect. And that was what Jonathan's book inspired in you.
Exactly. I mean, this was very much, from my perspective, a set of practical steps to be taken, not just a set of ideas to be pursued. And it was the sense that no other political party was making that case in Parliament, and therefore the need to have that green voice, that voice talking about the impact of production and consumption patterns on our environment, the fact that we can't go on having infinite economic growth on a planet of finite resources. There's that lovely quote by Kenneth Balding, the economist, who said anyone who thinks that infinite economic growth is possible on a planet of finite resources is either a madman or an economist. And I think they were sort of fairly accurate in that.
Or both.
Or both. So it was about how do you bring that kind of thinking into the political domain.
That's very interesting, because the question I was going to ask, which in a sense I think you've answered, you joined the Green Party in, I think, 1986. And the Greens did extremely well in the European elections in 1989, getting 15% of the vote. But before that, the Greens weren't really even a pimple on the electoral landscape. So it might have been a logical thing for you, particularly with your C&D history, to have thought Labour, or indeed another type of party, might have been an option more likely to succeed. But you went, I think, rather unusually, you went green, and it was this book of Jonathan's which really was the thing which pushed you in that direction, was it?
It was Jonathan's book that pushed me in that direction, but also I guess I spent most of my life trying to work out how you best bring about change, where you best need to be to bring about change. Because in parallel to what we're talking about now, obviously later on I worked for Oxfam. I was in a non-government organisation lobbying, trying that as a way forward. Obviously I'd been a protester when it came to being a member of CND. At one point also did a secondment inside DFID, the Department for International Development. And the whole time is trying to work out how do you bring about change. And while I certainly appreciate people who are inside the other parties trying to bring about change, and on that note, I just want to really remember and pay tribute to Michael Meacher, who died yesterday, who I think was a wonderful champion for the environment and a great person within Labour. I appreciate the roles that people like Michael played, but I also think you need force coming from outside the mainstream parties to push them. And what we always say, in a sense, is that one of the best ways to focus the minds of other politicians is to hit them where it hurts most, and that's the ballot box. So it's when you start to threaten them at the ballot box that people sit up and take notice.
Did you ever consider taking the example of Michael, who, as you say, was very much a Green activist within the Labour Party, joining, I'm saying Labour, but it could be one of the other parties actually, and trying to make the Green message as strong as you could there? Or were you always clear that a separate independent Green party was where you wanted to be?
I think the thing that would have stopped me joining any of the other parties was that what makes the Green Party's analysis of the environment and how we live in relationship with our planet is to do with our economic policies. And we always say if you're looking at another party's policies and you want to judge how green they are, don't look at the environment pages of their manifesto, look at the economic pages. And none of the other parties were coming close to the recognition, as I said earlier, that you can't have business as usual and just tack on a few green policies, as a bit of an afterthought. That essentially, if you're serious about living within our means, and that means not living as we are now, because if we were to extend the production and consumption patterns we have in this country to the whole world, then we'd need another 3 planets to absorb the wastes and to provide the resources. So it's that recognition that we need to change the economics that meant that I believed that the Green, and do still believe that the Green Party is essential.
How would you characterise, I was going to ask you about green politics and growth, and also green politics and science, but let me just ask about growth just now as you've raised it. How would you characterise your approach to economic growth and to other complicated words like prosperity and things of this kind? A caricature would say, and I say myself, it is a caricature, it's not what I believe is what you think, that it's open-toed sandals, etc., etc., etc. But you would say that's you would never be a caricature. But how would you characterise the green approach to growth and, as I say, prosperity, welfare of the population as a whole and so on? What's different about what the Greens and what you say to Labour, Conservatives, whoever?
I think it is just fleshing out the point that I made earlier, which was that on a planet of finite resources, the idea that you can go on having the same production and consumption patterns, the same linear model of extracting your resources, using them to make products, and then dealing with the waste at the end of the process, just isn't sustainable on a whole range of indicators. And of course, it's not just the Greens who are saying this. I mean, one of the best advocates of this critique, if you like, is Professor Tim Jackson. He used to be part of what was known as the Sustainable Development Commission, which was a quango that advised government. And while he was there, he wrote a report called Prosperity Without Growth. And the nice little story about that, I don't know if you know the story, was that when he wrote this report, government was rather startled and didn't like the idea of prosperity without growth. That was a little bit too heretic for them. So they forced him for the document for the Sustainable Development Commission to put a question mark after it. So for the version for the government said prosperity without growth, question mark. The version that he then published as a book, which you can just buy in any good bookstore, takes the question mark out, which I thought was quite significant. Because it takes you back to thinking about what do we mean by prosperity. Is prosperity simply more and more GDP? And there's so much analysis, as you will know, that GDP can double and triple, but on indicators of whether or not we're more happy with our lives, if we feel more content, if there's less crime, less tension, a whole set of indicators suggest we're not actually getting more content, we're not getting any happier, even though growth is going up. Now, obviously, you need enough growth to get by, you need enough stuff for basic needs. But again, he has a lovely phrase in there saying, one of the things that propels us to keep consuming, and of course, business as usual requires us to keep consuming, is the advertising industry. And he has a lovely phrase there about the advertising industry persuading us to buy things we don't need with money we don't have, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. And that kind of sums it up a little bit as well. What we're saying here is not no growth, stop all growth now. That would be a crazy thing to say. And certainly people in poorer countries absolutely have the right and expectation to be able to develop much more quickly and more equitably than they have to date. But in a sense, if they're going to do that, it means that we have to change our economic patterns even more dramatically to enable that to happen. Now, we want to see growth in some areas. I would love to see growth in the green economy, more investment in energy efficiency and renewable energies and so on. But what it does mean is that if you're going to put growth into there, you probably need to take growth away from somewhere else. And one of the key areas that I would suggest would be a good place to start would be, just as there's this big debate going on at the minute as to whether or not we should expand Heathrow or expand Gatwick, the green position will be, actually, aviation is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. Can we please not expand either? So that is that was what would make it a little bit different.
And do you feel today, in the role you now play, that you have a reasonably good level of dialogue with green thinking people in other political parties, or are you very much batting your own argument, or is there a dialogue you feel you can have? I know you serve on the relevant select committees of the House of Commons and work with people in that regard, but how do you describe the quality of the discussion that you have with green thinking people in other parties?
I mean, I think there certainly are green thinking people in the other political parties, which is just as well, because as 1 out of 650, even I can do the maths and work out that's not a very strong position to be in. You need to make allies. Getting success in Parliament is about finding common ground and making common cause with people who share your views on a particular issue. And there are certainly people in the other parties who, perhaps wouldn't go quite as far as I've just described, although we have just set up, actually, with Rupert's help here in the front row, an all-party group called Limits to Growth. And I had a conversation with Rupert saying, if you call it Limits to Growth, are you quite sure we're going to get other people from other parties joining this thing? And Rupert said, yeah, it's going to be fine. And it has been fine. We do have members from all parties who are beginning to grapple with this issue, because I think, as you see all of the indicators now in terms of the wildlife that have now no longer, on our planet shared with us, if you look at the climate arguments, if you're looking at pollution generally, the writing is on the wall. It's very clear we can't go on just having a kind of end of pipe cleanup at the end of the day. We need to shift our thinking about the economy. And so I take some comfort in the fact that there are some kindred spirits who are beginning to go down this road as well.
Moving from the policy area to the cruder politics, you became leader of the Green Party in 2008 and stayed till 2012, 4 years, a fairly short term. I know leadership's been, I won't say contested, it's been slightly controversial within the Green Party about whether you have leaders or not, whether leaders are appropriate people in contemporary politics, if I can put it like that. And you had 1 or 2 controversial predecessors in that sense as well. How did you address this question of leadership, and what made you think I should try to be the leader of the Green Party? And then in turn, what led you to think after one general election, actually, I'm going to stand back from the leadership and ask somebody else to take it on? I think leadership's a very difficult issue, and I'd be interested to hear your reflections on it, particularly from a party which has thought a lot about leadership, but there's not always been clarity about what the role of the leader is. Quite
fairly put. So yes, I think it is fair to say that the Green Party has had quite a healthy suspicion of traditional forms of leaders. And to be honest, if you look around, we haven't had that many great models of leadership. You've got either the sort of clanking fist of Gordon Brown, or you've had the kind of the spin of other leaders. And I think, people are quite rightly a little bit suspicious about the power of party leaders and what that then does to the rest of the party. And, at its most extreme, you then have situations where, party conferences and party memberships are really just a sideshow, and everything is handled by a very small number of people in the party who make policy and direct in that way. And I think that goes fundamentally against the Green Party policies, which are around empowerment, about recognising that we can all be leaders in different ways. So that is a starting point. But having said that, we also recognise that, particularly in today's world where so much of political communication goes on via the media and so on, that if you're presenting a different person each time, a journalist comes up and wants to talk to you, you get a chance to be on Question Time, then actually that's quite confusing for people. And people do want to be able to relate to a person. They want to get a sense of whether or not they would trust that person, rather than just relating to a set of abstract ideas. I think our ask, if you like, in terms of the policy package we put forward is probably, ambitious enough, and to make it even more difficult by changing the person who's talking about it each time you hear about it is just muddling. So for me, it was about thinking our mission here is urgent, and that was something else I should have said earlier, in a sense, I suppose, that what makes the Green Party different about some of these policies is we don't think we've got forever to get this right. The clock's ticking. So if we've got an urgent message, if we want to get across an idea that change is necessary but also beneficial and positive, then how do we best do that? And it was through thinking, essentially, that the role of a leader is somebody who can articulate that as effectively as possible. In our party, however, leaders don't have any other, privileges. So we just have one vote on our party executive alongside other, another 15 people who are members of that party executive. And we have to stand for re-election every 2 years. And you might ponder how politics might have been different if Tony Blair, for example, had to stand for re-election every 2 years within his party. So it's quite a good way of grounding you to make sure you don't lose touch with your grassroots in the party. So I stood for 2 sets of those 2-year terms, but then did decide to stand down for 2 reasons, really. Partly because Brighton Pavilion, my constituency, was more marginal then than it is now, thankfully. And so I wanted to be able to make sure that that seat was kept and that people had a real sense of me on the ground in Brighton. But also partly, to be honest, because I think that it, being the leader gave me a profile that I was able then to use to help me win Brighton Pavilion. And we want to be able to spread that around. We want other people to use the leadership role to be able then to hopefully get their profile up, to get more well known, and then perhaps also to be able to use that to get themselves elected or to help others to get elected as well. So that was the thinking.
Very difficult choice for you. I mean, my perception from outside was that you were thought generally to have done a very good job as leader of the party, not just in terms of winning Brighton Pavilion, but in getting credibility for the Green argument. And that faded away a bit after that you finished. But maybe that's unfair view. You probably wouldn't want to comment on that. Okay, you then in 2010 went for selection as the Green candidate for Brighton Pavilion after you'd been selected leader, I think or perhaps it was just before, I'm not sure. And you had to deal with an incumbent Green candidate who was all there, who you decided to challenge, and it was obviously a difficult set of circumstances. And it made me think that you had perhaps got a ruthlessness which people don't always think about, think of you in quite this way. Well, we can ask them here. Which is a striking thing, because to challenge an incumbent is a hard thing. It's when I was selected as a Labour candidate for Norwich South, I wasn't challenging an incumbent. It was a choice between a range of different people. And it must have been quite a tough thing. So it just brought to mind, are you in fact a fairly ruthless politician? I don't mean in terms of personal ambition, but in terms of what you're trying to achieve. What's your political personality? You come across as extremely reasonable, very positive, but are you actually under it quite sharp, quite hard, quite tough?
It does feel like it's a question to ask someone else, actually, rather than to ask the person to make that judgment on themselves. I will say that it was just about the hardest decision I've ever made, was to take on fighting for that selection in Brighton Pavilion. The Green candidate who'd done such a good job the previous 2 times, Keith Taylor, was a very, very good friend, and he had done an extraordinary job in getting the Green Party up to, I think, 23% of the vote as it was at the election before 2010. And I guess what made me feel that I needed to do it was the number of people that were coming to me asking me to do it and recognizing that it's going to be such an uphill battle. And once you've got to 23% of the vote, then every extra percentage to get is going to get harder each time to do it. And that the extra profile I had then as leader would mean that I would have a better chance than he would of actually making that last leap. And that is a really hard thing to say to somebody. I mean, fortunately, it's all ended happily. He's now a member of the European Parliament and is doing brilliantly there, and everything's fine. But it was a really hard decision. And I think, to answer your question, I hope I'm not ruthless, but I do think that at the end of the day, personalities apart and trying to deal with it as best you can, if you're serious about a political party or indeed anything else you're doing, then you have to put that as the central focus. And if you genuinely believe that that is the best way of getting representation for your party, then I think as long as you can try and do it in the best possible way, then...
Personally, I agree with you very much, but I think it's a rather rare quality, actually. There's lots of people, even right at the top of politics, who duck away from those kinds of questions when it comes around. And that's why when I was looking you up, as it were, before this evening, I was struck that you'd taken that course.
I think for the Green Party as well, to be honest, we have so few opportunities to have let that one go. I think would have been unforgivable in a way.
Okay, so we've now gone through to this Parliament, and you've done a couple of interviews recently about, you did a letter to Jeremy Corbyn about working together. You made a remark which I'm not sure whether it's quoted correctly. It said, it could be the best thing possible for the Greens if Labour lost. That wouldn't be the outcome I wished for. You said you weren't wanting that, but it might be. Do you think now that it is the best thing possible for the Greens that Labour did lose the election, and then taking it on further, that Jeremy Corbyn has been elected leader of the party? Is that good news for you, bad news for you? How do you see it?
I can't remember the context of that line, I must admit. I don't think it's a good thing that Labour lost.
There was an interview in The Guardian. But I was surprised, that's why.
Yes, maybe it was my fault of the way it was expressed. But anyway, one could be critical of all political parties, but I think it would not surprise anyone to say that the Green Party is a lot closer to Labour than we are to the Conservatives. Yeah. And so I would not want Labour to have lost, and I'm sorry that they did. In terms of Jeremy Corbyn, I think there are some real opportunities there. I mean, on one hand, it is quite nice to hear policies that the Green Party have been banging on about for years, like bringing rail back into public ownership, now having the voice of Labour behind them as well. And I was challenging Jeremy in a friendly way to say, well, that's delightful that you're now supporting this, and I have a private member's bill down and on bringing rail back into public ownership, and if you'd care to bring your troops behind that, that would be very lovely. So it is, on one level, really positive to have someone else and a whole party, or at least sections of a whole party, now reinforcing some of the key messages that the Greens have been talking about for a long time. What excites me too about Jeremy is that I think potentially he, at least, is somewhat less tribal. I'm not necessarily talking about people around him, but I think he is potentially less tribal than some previous Labour leaders. I think that he is more likely to look at the writing on the wall and recognise that if they are serious, as I'm sure they are, about trying to win future elections, then they are going to have to work with other parties. And that, to me, is the key that could unlock so much. I'm excited that he's given one of his shadow ministers, John Trickett, the responsibility for rolling out what's being called a constitutional convention, which, as I understand it, will be an opportunity to look at things like reform of House of Lords, but also things like changing the voting system. It's interesting, I think, that the unions have now changed their position on proportional representation, the fairer voting system, and now the unions are in favour of that too, which is a really big change. Jeremy himself has said to me that as long as some kind of PR system was chosen that still kept some kind of constituency link, then he would be interested in that. John MacDonald, Shadow Chancellor, has come out also now saying he's changed his mind on PR. So all of this mood music around perhaps seeing if there could be a way of having some kind of, I've called them progressive pacts or whatever, into the future, I think is something positive. Because the thing that breaks my heart is when you've got two relatively progressive politicians fighting it out in a constituency under first past the post, and then through the middle comes the Conservatives, and they are laughing all the way, and we are just left,
I do understand the point you're making, and I generally have always argued for working with other parties across. I consider that within Labour that was one of the views I broadly took about how we should approach things, and in fact in a previous set of lectures here, the Too Difficult box, I argued we should see much more cooperation across different parties to tackle some of the big problems we have. Nevertheless, there are absolutely massive problems going down this route. The Constitutional Convention, you argued in your letter to Jeremy, I agree, that's a process of being able to look at it. But you also said you thought there was potential in considering local grassroots electoral pacts where progressive candidates are standing, and you've just referred again to that. Do you see that as a real possibility? Because I have to confess, I can't quite see that. And funny enough, I can see that with the Liberals, where the Liberals are stronger in certain seats. Your two, I think I'm right in saying, your two top seats other than your own that you're going for, Norwich South here and Bristol West.
I think that will need to be revised.
Yeah.
I think after the results of the last election, you know, there is thinking now going on in our party to think about where the next targets are going to be. And it may well be that we're looking at different places. And I take your point that places where Liberals are there might be, you know, if you're looking at somewhere like the Isle of Wight, where the Greens actually beat Labour, that might be a more interesting place. So I think we've got a job of work to do. Having said that, I'm not suggesting that I think local pacts will be easy, but I am recognising that even if we get Labour on board for proportional representation, that's not going to change the outcome in 2020. However dismayed those of us on the left are about the Conservative government majority, and we are dismayed the fact that they are the government, their majority is only 12, and that can be shed very quickly over the course of a parliament with you know, people passing on and so forth, losing by-elections and so on. But it seems to me that if we're serious about trying to get a different complexion even at this next election, we wouldn't need to find that many places where some kinds of deals could be done. Now, I know how difficult it will be, and I know for sure that it shouldn't be done just by, you know, the politicians themselves behind closed doors doing it. You've got to involve people somehow in those constituencies. But given that it wouldn't take that many to be able to change the complexion at the next election, I certainly think it's worth exploring.
I mean, certainly it's the case that the Tories only have to lose 6 seats at the next general election to lose their overall majority. And then the question is what alliance could then be formed. And personally, I think the most difficult question that is how would Labour work with the SNP in those circumstances for all kinds of reasons.
We're already working on that in Parliament. There's another all-party group around progressive alliances that is bringing together Labour, hopefully Liberal and SNP, and just trying to remove some of the toxicity which it certainly exists between Labour and SNP. And I think one of the best ways to reduce that is by looking at some practical campaigns that we can work on together to build trust again. And it seems to me that if we were looking for a candidate for such a campaign, then looking at the EU referendum would be a very good place to start, because I think there's a lot of common cause that progressives can make around a progressive reason for staying inside the EU.
Very encouraging to hear your optimism about this. I get the argument and I share the view. I mean, I was influenced when I was a lot younger going to listen to a speech from Willy Brandt when he said, the future is red-green. And I've always myself believed that. But how do you make that go in electoral systems? Obviously PR it's easier, but in the system that we have, it's quite difficult to see how it works.
We've got to break into this system in some way, which is why, although I appreciate it's not going to be easy, that is why we're talking about the possibility of being able to work in even if it's just a handful of constituencies, it might be enough to shift it. And if we can also at the same time be building these links around external campaigns, be it on the EU, be it on climate or whatever, then I think there's a chance at least of building up a trust and being able to entertain the thought of this. And I think as Labour itself sits and crunches through some of the numbers, they are going to recognise they're going to have to work with others. And I know it goes against the grain for a lot of them, but ultimately I think the public would actually quite like it.
I'm sure that's right. My final question before throwing over to you, so would you just be thinking what questions you'd like to ask Caroline, is the one I mentioned earlier about science. I've always thought there's an interesting question for green organisations, whether they're opposed to change in a general sense, or whether they can see that scientific advance can actually be green and beneficial. A classic example for this campus is genetic modification, where there's been a great deal of work done in this university. It's one of the centres in this area, and I know you've campaigned against it in a number of different areas. And I just want to explore that. Is it something that you think could never be done in what I'll call a green way? Is it something one should simply dismiss completely because of the dangers that are there? is it something that you think actually properly done by your definition? There could be the various benefits of GM could bring benefits of various kinds, but it requires a different regulatory regime or whatever. Can you just talk through this science question? Because Greens sometimes, I hope you'd excuse me saying it, just come across against scientific progress. And I know that's not actually true, because I've met many Green friends for whom that definitely isn't the case. But and indeed the Green organisations, some of them about protection, preservation, those kind of words, i.e. no change, as opposed to just green. So could you just talk a little bit about how you see what is a rather difficult relationship, I think?
Well, I certainly wouldn't associate Greens with saying no change. I think Greens want a hell of a lot of change. I think if anyone was going to make a criticism, it's rather more that, will you stop changing everything? Because, that is more the frame that I would look through. I would certainly challenge, as you would expect that I would, the idea that we are anti-science. I think we have to ask, in a sense, science for what and who is in control of it. And when it comes to GMOs, there's been an awful lot of rhetoric and building up hope that there's going to be this magic rice, for example, that's going to cure world hunger. And it just worries me that while we are pursuing that, actually, most people would say the problems of world hunger are actually to do with distribution and to do with a lot of political issues, rather than the fact that we don't have enough particular forms of rice, for example. So, I would not be against any technology on some ideological ground. I would be against it if I felt that it was diverting resources from more practical ways of achieving the response we're trying to achieve. There are, the ways in which some of the GM trials have been undertaken, for example, when they've been external, outside field trials where you can get the pollen, travelling vast distances. I'm deeply concerned about those. I wouldn't support that, because I think the risks associated with that are too high. If someone were to say to me that, that GM is the answer to world hunger, and if also you had people from the south saying the same thing, which by and large, I know it's a very large generalisation, but by and large there are not lots of clamouring people in developing countries saying we want GMOs. They're actually talking about different changes to land ownership, to the role of corporations in their countries and so on. There are a whole set of political reasons, and sometimes I think things like GMOs can look like a swift technical fix. They are usually in the hands of corporations who are going to make significant personal profits out of it, and the worst case scenario of that was when there was certainly a discussion in the early days of having so-called terminated technology, whereby seeds could not be replanted at the end of their cultivation, and so farmers would be ultimately and always dependent on the seed companies. I think what we've seen in places like India, where we've seen many farmers literally killing themselves because the yields have not been, after a while, what they had been promised to be, but by that time their soil is incredibly contaminated. So these are all kind of detailed reasons for being concerned about GM, but I don't think it's a question of saying we're against science. We want to look at some of the impacts that are already being had, we want to look at who's in control of it, we want to look at the risk assessment, we want to apply the precautionary principle, and if all those are in place, then that's great. And certainly we're not going to get to where we need to be on a whole range of technical green issues unless we are absolutely pressing science into play to be able to help us. So I hope that we can indicate a positive position on science, even if we are concerned about certain scientific applications right now. And I think that issue, when you said, in a sense, that many green organisations use the word about protecting and preserving and conserving, I don't think that needs to mean don't change. I think it can actually mean changing things quite radically in order to be able to protect and so forth. So I don't think many green organisations are actually saying keep the status quo. Change is certainly what we're going to need to do. It's in whose interests and who's controlling it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I've had my bit. We've got about half an hour left. As I said, I'm going to take questions from the floor. I'll take them in threes, if that's okay. And we've got some roving mics moving around.
I'm going to do it in threes. Can I just get a pen, because my memory...
Oh, would you prefer me to do it in ones?
No, I just will scribble down
I
what you say.
I can do it...
Oh, marvellous.
Do you want a pen?
Yes, thank you.
So I can't write down the names either. Oh no, I've got a pen. Lo and behold, I have another pen. There we go.
Good, we're ready.
That's what you call planning. application of science. Okay, I'm going to start over on that side. So it's the gentleman with a, ladies, with a blue, that you, yes. Then gentleman with the long hair, yes, maroon. Then coming down, the lady with grey hair, just here. So you three, first. And can I just say, could you identify yourself and any particular affiliation, please?
Janet Garton, I'm a former professor at this university, Scandinavian Studies. Is there anything that can be done to stop the government from slashing the subsidies to solar power companies and putting British firms out of business?
Thank you. Just in front. Yeah.
Hi there. My name's Chris Friedler. I'm a climate change student here at UEA. And I wanted to ask you, if you believe that, and the Green Party's position is that the economic system needs to change in order for environmental policies to be successful, do you consider the current previous government's policies on climate change doomed to failure?
Okay. And the lady just in front, just down a bit. That's right. Yep, that's you.
I'm Anne Filgate, and I'm from North Norfolk Green Party, and we've got a by-election coming up on the 19th of November. So I'm writing a leaflet at the minute, and I'm very worried about how I approach all this new group of people who voted UKIP recently. I mean, I never see them in my daily life. I don't know who they are. And how do the Greens approach them on a leaflet to make them change?
3 challenging questions.
Right, I'm glad I had the pen at least. Okay, so the first question from Janet was a very good question about how to get the government to see sense around their reckless slashing of the support to the solar industry. And it is an incredibly well-made question. We're looking at the situation whereby the government is likely to be cutting its support to the solar industry by 87%. And this is at a time when, if the subsidies to solar continue just for another 2 or 3 years, solar would then be able to stand up on its own 2 feet without any subsidy at all. It would achieve what's called grid parity, and it would then, be fighting on its own terms. Solar already employs tens of thousands of people in our country, and we're putting at risk at least 27,000 of those jobs by this measure. And it makes no sense at all. I mean, I wish to try and answer you directly, how do we make the government see sense on it? I honestly don't know, because all of the economic reasoning and the environmental reasoning and the logic points to the, frankly, stupidity of what they're doing. And what makes me most angry is when I challenge, for example, the Energy Secretary, Amber Rudd, about why this is being done. And she'll tell me it's because we can't keep making hard-working families pay for an extra amount of money on their bills in order to help support solar. And that is just such a hypocritical argument, when at the same time this very week, the government is locking us into this vastly expensive nuclear deal, which will mean that for 35 years, we are locked into paying much, much higher prices than we would otherwise need to in order to persuade the Chinese and the French to come in and build this nuclear power station. So, I mean, I've got a meeting actually with Amber Rudd next week to eyeball her, and I'm taking up a couple of the solar companies from Brighton so she can hear directly from them. It makes no sense, and to be honest, I think it's obviously the Treasury behind this, not the Department for Energy and Climate Change. And I think what we've seen over recent years, obviously the Treasury is always the most important department, but it seems right now that their tentacles are in every single bit of government. And because George Osborne basically has just got it into his head that environment is a distraction from our economic difficulties rather than a way out from them, that is what is causing the problem here. You know, he says ridiculous things like, we will not save the planet by putting Britain out of business. No, and no one is suggesting that we do, because actually last time I looked on the planet, green industries are doing really well for jobs. It's really good for the economy. And so, you know, to talk about cutting off your nose to spite your face, I don't know what we do about it, but I'm hoping that there'll be enough outcry to mean that they will look at this again, because it just seems to me utterly, utterly crazy. Second one, sorry. Climate policy.
I'm hoping somebody else is going to press another button just like that. That was very impressive.
Climate doomed to failure. No, I don't. I mean, I welcome, for example, things like under the previous Labour government, the Climate Change Act. That was a really good piece of architecture, the idea that there is a binding act that requires governments to reduce emissions year on year. I suppose what worries me is that the targets that are in that act are being politically selected rather than scientifically selected. And I believe one of the reasons for that goes back to the fact that governments are too afraid of the kind of economic changes that would be required if we were to be serious about the scientific targets that are required. And so what I mean by that is, even this 80% cuts by 2050 that everybody talks about, that's the reduction in emissions that is generally agreed to be required if we're to stay below 2 degrees warming. If you actually unpack the amount of risk that is built into 80% cuts by 2050 to lead you to be below 2 degrees, it is still taking a 67% chance that we will not meet that. And someone has decided that that is a politically acceptable risk. I think if most people in the general public knew that that was the risk inherent in all of the architecture we are building on, they would be pretty skeptical and concerned. If someone said to you, that plane, do take it by all means, but it's got a 67% chance of falling out of the sky before you get to the other end, the chances are you probably wouldn't take it. So I think that although I welcome, the certain steps that have been taken, we have got more investment in renewables now than we had a few years back, we have got more attention going into getting our emissions down, I worry that in terms of the urgency of getting emissions down fast enough, that is not going to be done until we get politicians who are willing to look at the scientific evidence, rather than have what scientists, I think, themselves are slightly guilty of, I have to say, which is that quite a lot of the time you feel that scientists in this area are reframing their arguments to ministers based on what they think is politically acceptable. And I don't think scientists should be censoring themselves in that way. And I've talked to people from the Tyndall Centre and elsewhere who recognise that this is going on. And somehow, if we are serious about the risks inherent in exceeding 2 degrees, then we have to know that scientists are saying it as they see it, and that if there are trade-offs being made, and if there are decisions about risk being made, that ought to be done in a much more public way than is being done at the moment.
Your activists looking for a hand in writing the leaflets.
Yes, that's probably, yes. Well, I guess one starting point might be that an awful lot of people, I think, who are voting UKIP are not voting UKIP because they are backward-looking, mean-minded little Englanders. They are voting UKIP because they want to give the system a great big kick up the bum. And to that extent, I think we can have some sympathy with them. And so maybe it's partly a case of demonstrating how the Greens, right across the board, are wanting to change the way in which politics is done, that wants to listen to people much more, that wants to have people to be more empowered. Because in a sense, in your leaflet, you've got two choices, because you haven't got very many words, or much space, presumably, unless it's a very long leaflet, which then defeats the point I hastily add, having been a leaflet writer of many years. You could tackle them head on about refugees, about immigration, and so on. I'm not sure in a leaflet and a number of bullet points necessarily that's the best way to do it, but perhaps something about how the Greens stand for far-reaching political change, that we recognise so much of our political system is, I don't think the word corrupt is too strong a word to use in that context, that needs to be changed, then perhaps you might appeal to some of them. But we could talk afterwards, because I'm not sure that's a full answer.
Okay, I'm going to take another set of three. I'm going to go over that side of the room now. The lady just, that's right, you first. Gentleman here in a blue shirt and the gentleman here in a green t-shirt. So you first.
Hello, my name's Amanda Hopkinson and I'm also a former professor from here now at London. And my question is about refugees, which is a huge question, and I want to ask a very narrow one. I belong to a local group called Sanctuary Norfolk, campaigning to bring in, just at the moment, the minimum 50 families that we can have fully funded, brought from the camps by the UNHCR, fully funded by the European Union to reside here. And I was surprised last night. I went to speak at a meeting in Aylsham, which is small town near here, and for the first time in many, many years, the priest told me, the church was absolutely full. And it was all local people who were absolutely up in arms and wanting to do something about Syrian refugees. The logjam we're in is that as Sanctuary Norfolk, we've been talking to County Council leader who is responsible overall for joining up the dots and making sure that anyone coming in has housing, access to healthcare, education and so on. And they're very adamant that until and unless the government provides unconditional funding for the indefinite future, they will do nothing. So we're completely stuck here. You know, there is an enormous groundswell of popular support wanting to make change. There is a legal requirement to bring in at least a minimum number of families, and there is no political will, starting with the government, to make this happen.
Thank you, Amanda. Gentleman just in front here, that's right.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Jones. I work at the Sainsbury Laboratory at the John Lewis Centre. And I'm delighted to hear you say that you don't think scientists should be censoring themselves, so I won't.
I think I might be about to regret that, but go on.
So I work on plant disease resistance, and in particular have a GM potato trial to try and control potato late blight. And I do wonder whether the Greens really do have, as Mark Linus has suggested, essentially a pick and mix approach to science advice, given that all the major scientific societies, National Academy of Sciences of the US, Royal Society, European academics, have agreed there's absolutely nothing intrinsically dangerous about the GM method, which is just a way of putting DNA into a plant, conferring a property on it. And in fact, this is something that's happened naturally. Sweet potatoes were naturally GM, and they probably happened 10,000 years ago. So the thing that's so damaging to me about opposing the technology per se is that it actually detracts from having the right discussion, which is a discussion about what kind of agriculture we want to encourage. So there's certainly no doubt in my mind, again, not censoring myself, that this technology has a great contribution to make to increasing the sustainability of agriculture. But it can be used to deliver various kinds of genes for various kinds of purposes. So I'd love to have a proper discussion with Greens about what the right genes are to put in and why. But we can't get beyond the silly argument about whether there's intrinsically something dangerous about the method when there isn't.
Thank you. And the final one is the gentleman down here, just in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an inspiring talk once again. So my name's Matthew Bone. I'm a PhD student in environmental science. And I'd first like to ask a question and then make a comment. Now, would the UK actually benefit from the gradual separation of politics and business at high levels within the political system? And if so, how? And the comment on the solar industry cuts, could that be a way of actually destroying competition and pave the way for another monopoly-controlled market in the future?
Okay, thank you. Again, three excellent questions. Quite tough for you, I'm afraid, Caroline. I don't mean Jonathan's question in the middle, but all three of them are putting you on the spot.
Well, on the sanctuary movement locally, I mean, first of all, I'm really delighted that it exists and that it's thriving, and in Brighton as well. Brighton is a city of sanctuary, and I've been very involved in that, and I think it's a really inspiring counterweight, really, to the government's reluctance to move on this, to see the willingness of so many ordinary people to try to find a way of being able to give refuge to people who are fleeing and desperately need it. In terms of the logjam you're describing, in the sense that there's a public will to be able to do more, and yet local governments are understandably, in a way, saying that they would probably like to do more, but they can't do it until they get more funds. I mean, I have a sympathy for those local governments, because they have had so many millions cut from their budgets, and just seeing what's going on locally in Brighton right now, when they're trying to decide whether or not to cut adult social care or whether or not to cut mental health services. How on earth can you make those decisions? They're awful. So I do have sympathy with the sense that we need to have proper funding coming from government to enable this to happen. But one way that I've been trying to work on this is, I don't know what the situation would be in this area, but in Brighton, there is a group of maybe 70 Syrian people who are already here, a settled Syrian community. And they are particularly desperate to be able to bring their wider family here who are fleeing. And it seems to me that one of the things we could do is to try to persuade the government to broaden its definition of family reunion. Because right now, as you probably know, if you're, let's say you're a Syrian person, you've been living here several years, you've got a right to remain, and you want to bring your grandparents over, then you can't do that. You can't bring over a child who's over the age of 18. There have been some terrible cases that I've been dealing with where, because the child is over 18, they can't be reunited with parents who are already here in the UK. And I've just put down an early day motion on it, actually just today. So one thing to lobby MPs about would be to see if they might try and support that, because the reason that I think that might be part of the answer is that if you've already got a Syrian community based locally, then to some extent we might be able to persuade local authorities that the strain on their much stressed local services might be rather less if you've already got something of a support network already there. So I think that's part of the answer, but certainly I think broadly speaking what we need to be doing is just making the government more aware of public willingness to see them move more dramatically on this. And we've already seen a little example of that with the bishop's letter that was made public just last weekend, and now David Cameron is saying, okay, well, we'll have 1,000 by Christmas. It's still nowhere near enough, but it is indicative, I think, that he will move if pressure builds strongly enough to persuade him in that direction. The second question about GM. I mean, if there was a conversation we can be having about GM experiments that are happening in a way where they are not at risk of leaching into external areas. What I'm talking about is things that are happening in laboratories rather than in fields. Then I think there's far more areas for us to discuss. I think the worry has been where there has been cross-contamination in many countries, and you all know that too, and if we want to make sure that into the future we have non-GM crops available as well as GM crops, then we've got to be able to know that it's possible to separate the two. I mean, I guess you would agree with that?
How can you contaminate something with a method?
Because you're not contaminating it with a method, you're contaminating a particular insert that you've made into that particular plant, and therefore if you find people, and there have been plenty of research papers out there that suggest that for some people there are some health risks associated with certain GM, then you don't want to be able to have all GM and nothing but GM. And so I think what people want to know is that they're going to have the choice to choose non-GM in the future if they want to. And the worry is that if you've got lots of field trials, then what you're having is the risk of that contamination. And I think as well, when it comes back to things like, you know, we've been told many times that GM is going to solve so many of the world's ills, you know, many of the diseases and so on. And yet when you look at some of the issues around yellow rice, for example, millions of pounds put into it is still not actually in a place where it is going to solve the blindness issues that it's meant to be solving. And meanwhile, it just worries me about the diversion of resources going into that aren't going into other areas. You know, we know essentially how to get more food to more people. And it's about political solutions, not technical solutions. Now, if there is a purely technical problem that can be solved by a purely technical GM response in a way that doesn't bring about risk, brilliant. But right now, that's not what I'm seeing. And what I am seeing is a few companies with a lot of power having an awful lot of control in this area. And I am seeing a lot of farmers in many parts of the world who are deeply concerned about what that does to their independence when they want to be able to choose, for example, to have a different kind of crop, and their soil is now contaminated, so they can't produce non-GM even if they wanted to.
Okay. Gentleman in the front.
Separation of politics and business, which probably echoes some of that previous debate in a sense. I think I am deeply worried about the role of business in politics. And by that, I mean things like when I put a freedom of information question as to ask how many people from the big 6 energy companies are inside the Department of Energy and Climate Change drawing up energy policy. There is a lot of them. I can't remember the number off the top of my head now, but there are significant numbers of people now from business who are not just lobbying MPs. Of course, they're going to lobby MPs. They're kind of, you know, missing out the bother of having to lobby an elected official and just going straight to Whitehall, getting themselves inside a number of key departments and essentially shaping the kind of policy that comes out of them. I think that's worrying. I think it's worrying that we had what was supposed to be a lobbying and transparency bill. It's now an act that was supposed to be a way of at least having some transparency over who is lobbying whom for what reason. And that was massively changed as it was going through Parliament, so that actually the result of that has been that most corporate lobbyists are not covered by it at all, because you're only covered by it if you are a company that only does corporate lobbying, whereas most corporate lobbyists work for companies like, dare I say, Shell or BP or one of these others, and they're not covered by it at all. The people that are covered by it, ironically, are the non-government organisations who now have far less scope to campaign, particularly at times of elections. So it's had a real chilling effect. So I think that we should be rightly worried about the impact of business on politics. And I think that in a way, perhaps that's also linked to the question, your second question, and the question that came up earlier about solar. I think that solar does deeply challenge the big six energy companies, because with solar you've got the possibility of far more community energy. You've got the possibility of power, not just meaning energy power, electric power, but political power, going to communities who can then produce their own energy. Hurrah! But that is quite a challenge to the business model that the big six energy companies are using. So I think that if we could get more of community energy, and if we could get some of the business voices out of DEC and replace them with some of the community energy companies, we might have an energy policy that is in the better interests of all of us.
Okay, I'm going to try and take a group of three from the middle of the hall, because I've been at the edges. I've got a group of three right in the middle there. There's a guy with a green shirt, and then to his left, a woman there, and just in front, a guy there. So if you can get the mic across, great. Thank you, and we'll take those three. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jonas Schönefeld. I'm based here at the Tyndall Center. I'm working on political science. You started off your talk by talking about your kind of search for how to make a change, or how to make changes in general. And I was just wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about that, what your conclusions were at the end of that journey, and you know what your insights now that you've been in Parliament for a while.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joanne Reid. I'm a sixth former in the city, and I'm a member of the Labour Party, more aligning with the
wave, could you? I can't see where you are. It's just there,
more aligning with the left of it. And I was wondering if the TTIP agreement goes through the EU, would your attitude to the EU change to the extent that you might be in favour of leaving?
Thank you.
Gentleman there, that's right.
Hello, I'm John Harris Hall. I'm a retired GP. Just a very big question, really, that in two small phrases, if you did have power, what two things would you do to save the NHS from collapsing in the next couple of decades, as inevitably I think it will?
Okay, again, three challenging questions, Caroline.
Yeah. So the question about where you need to be to make change happen. I mean, I suppose I feel that I've spent my whole life trying to find out where you need to be to make change happen, and it always seems to be wherever I'm not. So you start off, if you like, being on your CND marches and thinking, well, you know, it would be great to have power on the inside in some way. And so then you get elected to the European Parliament, which is a wonderful place to be elected, and you're an MEP. But then you realise that actually, in terms of changing the view of the British government, actually the Greens could have 10 or 20 or even 30 MEPs, but because we've got such a centralised political system in this country, and the national media reinforces that unless you've got a voice at Westminster, in a sense, you don't change the political debate here. You might have some very useful technical changes that you can make in Brussels, but essentially you're not necessarily changing the debate here. So then you get elected to Brighton, and you think, this is it. I am now in Westminster, and I'm very glad to be in Westminster, and you know, I'm not downplaying that at all. But what you find then is that you've got ministers who are saying, well, yes, you might be right, but I couldn't possibly do that unless I got more of a sense from the public that they would accept it. So then you're thinking, you know, whatever rude words, but you know, bloody hell, I need to go back out there and be on the streets again. So it feels like you almost come full circle. And the good thing about that, I guess, is that power is actually with all of us. Politicians won't change unless they think it's politically safe to do so. And therefore, I think it means that power is actually with us. And sometimes we don't feel that, and we certainly don't feel that with our current electoral system. But I think one good reason for changing our electoral system would be that it would give power back to people more, and politicians generally would have to be more responsive to their constituents. So I think, you know, obviously, in order to make change happen, you need people in all the different places. You need people inside Parliament, you need people outside Parliament. But I guess what I've realised fairly obviously is that even when you've got people inside Parliament, for a lot of them from many other parties at least, unless they feel it is safe to move in a certain direction they will rarely do it, that you rarely get a politician who will really go against the public grain. TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which, in case people don't know about it, is a very nasty, secretive trade agreement that the EU is doing with the US. And the worst bit about it is something called the Investor-State Dispute Mechanism, which would allow private corporations to sue democratically elected governments if they felt that those governments were putting up barriers to trade. You know, there's annoying things like environmental regulations or safety regulations or workers' rights. And so it's very worrying, and it's already happening. So in Australia, there's already a case underway where Philip Morris is trying to sue the Australian government for introducing plain packaging on cigarettes, because that's a barrier to trade, and would they please not do that? So it's a bad thing, and we are campaigning very strongly against it. Would it mean, however, that I would then change the position that I have, which is that there is a strong progressive argument to be made to stay in a reformed EU? No, it wouldn't, and I have thought about this. I've thought about it on this issue and also on when you see the way in which Greece has been treated as well. There are good reasons to think, hang on a minute, you know, what is the EU doing here? But I think if we imagine that we would have a more benign trade policy if we withdrew from the EU, we're in a fantasy land, because the country that is driving TTIP most strongly is Britain. If you look at the kinds of bilateral trade agreements that Britain is already making with many countries, they include the very same investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. So it's already happening. And I think if you look at the EU there, it gives us our greatest chance of being able to make common cause with others from across the other EU member states to try to fight this. And you'll know that there have been some brilliant petitions that have been out there, you know, trying to stop this process, because many in other EU countries are really angry about it. I think that we need to make the distinction between the EU as a set of institutions and the current incumbents of it. And I think what we need to do if we want to change the EU is to change some of the governments who are currently running it, because right now it's an EU dominated by right-wing governments. I remember a time not so long ago, it was the EU 15, so it was quite a long time ago actually, but not that long ago, where there was a majority of environment ministers who were Green, because in other EU member states, the Greens are not just in parliament, they're in government, and you had 7 or 8 Green environment ministers. And as a result, we had some excellent policy coming out of the EU. And let's not forget things like the Robin Hood tax. That is the EU that is bringing about that small tax on financial transactions. The UK is doing nothing on that. Banking regulation, again, the EU is going further. So although having been a member of the European Parliament for 10 years, I'm under no illusion about the way in which the EU needs to change. I think the idea that we're going to do that by walking away from it is wrong. I think we've got to stay in there and push for a more progressive EU. And I just want to spend a couple more seconds on this, because I do feel passionately about it. And I think that those of us who want to see that need to be building a campaign for the kinds of changes we want to see in the EU now, because the kind of changes we want to see are not the kind of changes that David Cameron wants to see, but they are changes that others in other EU member states can find common cause with us around. And so the fact that that isn't on the ballot paper, as you know, a criticism would be that, well, that's all very well, you talking about this EU, that progressive EU is not on the ballot paper. No, it isn't. But the reason that it isn't is because we haven't been fighting enough to put it there. And I think those of us on the left have been ignoring the EU for far too long. And I think that we need to re-engage with a progressive EU and recognise the fact that, for all of its many, many flaws and faults, you know, to try to resolve difficult issues by discussion and negotiation, even if that's laborious and in loads of languages and requires lots of paper, how much better is that than fighting over it? And it's not so long ago that in the European Union, the countries of the European Union were trying to solve issues by bullets and bombs, and I would far rather they were doing it by very boring discussions, even if they take a long time. The NHS, how to sort out the NHS? Well, you asked me, you said 2 things, and I'm going to cheat slightly, because one thing is the NHS reinstatement bill, and I have a private member's bill down, which has been put together with a lot of help from a lot of people, and actually paying tribute to perhaps odd allies in different places. David Owen in the House of Lords has been incredibly helpful on this as well. We've been working with campaigners like Alison Pollock, and basically have written a bill that what it would do would be to repeal the marketisation of the NHS, not just the increasing privatisation of the past few years, but the increased role of the market in the NHS that has been happening for a great many years. And if we could get enough support behind that NHS reinstatement bill, interesting things could happen. Now, you know, how likely is that? Well, not immediately likely, but it is interesting that 2 of the co-sponsors of that bill were Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell before they were in their new exalted positions. And so if we could get the Labour Party to start championing that bill, that would be quite interesting. So I think that we do need to get that kind of role of that market out of the NHS, and at the very least, if you're just looking at things we could do more quickly and more achievably, then the idea of having to contract out and put out to tender so many services now, it's just so much time is going into that. You know, layers of bureaucracy being wasted doing that, which could be much better spent actually on the front line in the NHS. And I guess the second thing I would say would be something to do with making sure that we pay our nurses and our doctors better. I would scrap the new contract that junior doctors are having imposed upon them. I think it's not fair to suggest that working evenings and Saturdays is the same as working other times of the day. I think that actually junior doctors do work 7 days a week, unlike what Jeremy Hunt would perhaps like you to believe. The point is that if you want them to do that, not just on emergency care, but on so-called elective care, then it's not just the NHS that's going to have to work 7 days a week, it's our pharmacists, it's our social care, and so on and so forth. And that's where we need to be having the debate about, if we really want that, then how are we going to make that possible, and how are we going to make sure that people are properly paid to do it.
Caroline, it's been an absolutely bravura performance across such a wide range of difficult and complicated subjects, and your own passion, obviously for your own political beliefs, but for politics altogether, has absolutely shone through. And from my point of view, the purpose of this series is to try and show people what it is that drives politicians, and I think you've done that absolutely magnificently this evening. It's been really tremendous. So can we all express our appreciation and thanks to Caroline for giving